Welcome to Junkyard Theory, folks. And today's guest is somebody who creates languages for film, and that's a term called conlanging. And I did not know what it meant. I came across it like a couple of weeks back, and I was diving down the rabbit hole, and I found Mr. David J. Peterson. He's devised languages for languages such as Dothraki and Valyrian for Game of Thrones, and he's also worked on the upcoming Dune movie, and well, amongst quite a few others. And this is a session that I'm really excited for because it's a field that I absolutely have no idea about. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, how you doing? Nice to meet everybody. I'm happy to be here.
David, could you run me through your origin story in basically linguistics, and how you came across how you ventured out into film?
Yeah, I really had no interest in language growing up. I grew up with English and Spanish because my family spoke Spanish, but I wasn't really interested in learning languages. In high school, I just took Spanish because it was easy. And then I woke up one morning and I decided that I absolutely had to learn French because there were millions of people that spoke French and I wasn't one of them. And then I realized there are millions of people all over the world that spoke like tons of languages and I didn't speak any of them. So I decided to learn every language on the planet. And then that was the end of high school for me. And when I got to college, I started studying a bunch of languages. I mean, either on my own or in classes, I studied French, Latin, German, Arabic, Russian. And then I came to Esperanto, which was a language that was invented in the 19th century. And it was the first time I'd ever heard of somebody like making their own language. I couldn't imagine why. It's just a wild idea. And so then the next semester, I decided to take an introductory linguistics course because my mother thought I would like it. And she was right. And so I kind of switched gears and started studying linguistics. But during my very first linguistics course, I came up with the idea of creating my own language, but not for international communication, which was why Esperanto was invented, but just for my own personal use, just for fun. And I had such a great time doing it that I just kept up with it. And really saw no reason to stop. And so that was in 2000. And it's kind of carried me through the next 21 years. It's continued to be fun. And so I just keep at it.
And how did you start working on film? Like, how did that opportunity come about?
In 2009, there were many of us who created languages for fun. So I've been doing it, 2009, it would have been 9 years at that point, right? I met many others who created languages online, many who'd been doing it for years, many who were a lot better than I was, and I learned a lot from them. But what I came to understand was that that our work really wasn't valued commercially. So like there were people that got lucky every so often, but like when Mark Okran got the chance to create Klingon, but they weren't people who created languages. They were just linguists who got lucky, They never created a language before. So it was like, even when these opportunities arose, they weren't finding somebody who knew how to create languages. They just found somebody. But completely out of the blue, Dan Weiss, who was one of the producers of Game of Thrones, contacted the Language Creation Society asking to find somebody who could create the Dothraki language. And so what the Language Creation Society did at that point was they put together a competition and sent it out to language creators everywhere and said, if you want a chance to create a language for a television show, then apply. And so I did. Many others did as well. And then it was just a brutal, absolutely brutal competition. There were 2 rounds. The first round was judged by other language creators, and the second round was judged by the producers. I made it through both rounds of the competition, and I was selected as the language creator for Game of Thrones. And that was it. Before that, I was just creating languages for fun. After that, I was in Hollywood. But it was a slog. That competition was difficult, and I put everything I had into it. I really laid it all out on the line. If I hadn't won that, I probably never would have created a language again. I got lucky.
I remember watching the documentary that you were featured in, Conlang, and Jason Momoa credits the language itself for bringing out his character, like Khal Drogo's character, basically intensifying the performance. So a language that has just been artificially created has also helped elevate his performance, like the actor's performance. So how do you guys like start working with the actors once you've created the language?
I mean, it depends. It depends on the production. There are sometimes I never work with the actors, but in this case, like, the wonderful thing about working in the era that we work in is that I can just record everybody's line. So I do. I record every line on MP3, and I send it to the actors, and they listen to it and they repeat. Works out pretty well. Sometimes I work with the actors, and I think the results are better in general. Like I worked on a movie on Netflix called Bright, and that was the first thing I ever worked on that happened to shoot in Los Angeles, which is kind of funny because you think, it's Hollywood, so everything must happen in Hollywood, but like nothing ever shoots there anymore. But Bright filmed directly in the middle of Los Angeles, which was right next to where I live. And so I was there working with the actors before shooting started, and I was there on set every single day working with the actors, helping them get their pronunciation right. And that was a really, really satisfying experience, and I thought that the actors did a tremendous job. So, sometimes I get to do that, sometimes I don't. And I think that I can definitely help, but even so, it's a skill. It's a skill, and some actors are better than others. Like Jason, for example, he was really good. I mean, it took him a lot of work, working with my recordings, but he really knew how to make it his own, how to make it sound good, how to make it sound authentic. Really he took very well to the cues that I gave him. And in fact, after Game of Thrones, I worked with him several times, just developing accents for his other roles. Like I worked with him on a movie called The Bad Batch, another one with Bruce Willis. I always forget the name of that one. But he needed to do different accents, and I would help him with that. He seemed to really enjoy working with me, so that was nice.
That's cool. And how do you start creating a language for a specific production? Like, what notes do you get from the director, or what's your starting point?
Most of the time, so if it's a film, I talk to the director. If it's a TV show, I talk to the showrunners most often. And with them, like, I'm the language expert, right? They're typically not too savvy when it comes to language, and so I really just try to get from them anything that they're thinking. Like, just throw out any term you might want. You want the language to be soft or pretty or ugly or scary or whatever. Like, I'll just take whatever notes. And then the first thing I do is I develop a just kind of like a sound sample for the language. So it's not like a real language yet. It doesn't have any words. It doesn't have any meaning, but it does have a consistent sound, so that I can show them and say, this is kind of the sound I was thinking of. Does this match your expectations? And if not, what needs to change? Like, what's sounding off to you? So that's really the first step. because of course you don't want to go through and create like words and grammar or anything if at the end of it they're going to say we don't like the way it sounds, then you just have to rip everything out by the roots. So that's why I start with just the sound and leave, you know, the meaning to later, because you can set up an entire sound system and then go and create all the grammar after that without changing anything from the sound system. So that's what I do. Um, and you know, sometimes I nail it right off the bat. Sometimes I hit exactly the sound they have in their heads. Sometimes it's not as important, so they just, you know, need it to be within a certain range, and that's fine. And then sometimes there's a bit of back and forth. I create a sound, and they say that's not quite what we were thinking, and so I just get them to give me as much detail as possible, like just say anything, and then I go back, I retool it, I record new samples, I send them back. Until they decide, yeah, this is the sound that we want. Like that happened with the Warcraft movie. I remember I went forward and I thought that I had a sound. I thought it sounded pretty good. It was based on what I saw in the video game, but you know, I was trying to be maximally authentic to the video game, but it wasn't working for them. So I came up with, I think, 8 different ways to do it, and I said, which of these sounds closest? And they decided on one of them, and then I just pressed forward with that sound to make sure that this is the Orcish language, to make sure that it sounded exactly the way they wanted. Because you know, ultimately, that's what the job is. You're working for the director for a film or for the showrunners for a show, and you know they have to like what you're doing, or you're not going to be there. You know. So yeah, that's what I do at the beginning.
That's very interesting. Like you said, sound, like the way it sounds, like the rhythm, all of that forms like the baseline or the backbone for the language, and from there on, you start adding the layers, like the grammar and everything. But the question I have is, the audience is never really gonna know the grammar, right? So the effort that you guys put into creating a language, how does that seem to pay off, like later on?
I mean, that's not true that the audience doesn't know the grammar. They do. Um, you know, like, and there are so many examples of this. Not everybody, of course, you know,
Yeah,
but then not everybody
probably
is gonna,
linguistic students and enthusiasts of language, I guess.
just people that, I don't know, really grabs them, you know,
Mhm.
sometimes it's people that were never interested in language before, but it's like, it's the same thing with anything. Like, you know, if you look at Titanic, most of the audience isn't going to know or care that he used the same upholstery that was used in the real Titanic. And it was like only one person who saw that the stars were wrong, you know, and like the on a DVD release. So it's like, yeah, most people don't notice, most people don't care, and most directors, if somebody pointed out that the stars were wrong, wouldn't then go back and change the DVD and change the stars with CGI. But that's what James Cameron did. You know what I'm saying? So it's like
Yeah.
it's the same type of thing with this. But the truth is, like, um, a film is one thing, right? Because you see it once and then that's it. But even so, it only took like a week for somebody watching Avatar to like write up a letter to Paul Fromer and not be. They seem to do all right. But with a television show, especially, the more dialogue you have, the easier it is to tell if the language is fake, and the easier it is to tell to pick up on elements of grammar. And honestly, by by the last season of Game of Thrones, there were people good enough in all the languages that they could spot things instantly. Um, and I know that because they did. Uh, as I was watching the live airing of the first episode, still here? Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
So yeah, as I was watching the first episode of season 8 of Game of Thrones as it was airing, somebody tweeted me that they thought that Dothraki was wrong, um,
Mhm.
because like they said the numbers didn't match the subtitles, and I didn't know what they were talking about. So I went back afterwards and checked, and they were right. Um, the line as read said, the guy said in Dothraki something like, I don't know, like 8 goats and 3 sheep, but the subtitles said 12 goats and 11 sheep. And I went back and checked, and it wasn't like I made a mistake. They had asked me to translate 8 goats and 3 sheep, and so I did it. I sent it back. Somebody later on just changed the subtitle, and I don't know why. I still don't know why. I don't know why that was important, that they needed to change the numbers, but it wasn't important enough that they re-record the line or have me retranslate it. They just changed it, assuming that nobody would know, but somebody knew literally while it was airing. It took seconds for somebody to
Wow.
catch the error. So yeah, people figure it out. I mean, the only reason they're not figuring out means there aren't enough people watching it because they don't care. But if it's big enough, they'll find out, and they'll find out pretty quick.
So I apologize for the way I phrased the question. There are people who actually notice it, and
Yeah,
it's a very, I mean, it's hardly talked about conlanging. So I think like the importance, like there's quite a lot of depth. Like even when it comes to certain scenes, like Emilia Clarke's portrayal of Daenerys Targaryen, where she reveals that she knows Valyrian like all along. Like that's the mother
yeah,
tongue was such a pivotal moment in the series, and
yeah.
that adds to the story as well. So, were you part of the scripting stage, or did you get the script and then work on the language for that particular scene, or like how does does the script inform any of any grammatical changes or any evolution of the language that you create?
Well, they write the lines in English and tag them to be translated, but the full thing that goes into that, I mean, yeah, I create the language first, of
Mm-hmm.
course, because that's the first thing that happens.
Yeah.
And I create as much of it as I possibly can because it makes translation easier. I mean, you've probably translated stuff before in your life. Can you imagine if like the dictionary you were using wasn't complete, or like you just didn't have all the words? It slows things down a lot, you know. So it's just a lot quicker if you can do that stuff ahead of time, if possible. Um, so yeah, language comes first, then the scripts come, and I see what I have to translate. But then it's just also there are a couple things. One, there's just creative license, making sure that it actually sounds good in the language that you're translating. It actually sounds like it makes sense, and maybe it's not a literal translation to achieve that. But also, there's just the context that helps to do it. So for that scene in particular, right? The Valyrian that Krasny spoke was different from the Valyrian that Daenerys spoke. Daenerys spoke High Valyrian. Krasny spoke Astapori Valyrian, which was derived from High Valyrian, and it was a little bit different. Daenerys wanted to reveal that not only did she speak Valyrian, but that she also understood his variant of High Valyrian, his variant of Valyrian, rather. And so for that reason, when I translated A Dragon is Not a Slave, I decided to use the Astapori word for slave rather than the High Valyrian word for slave, so that she could make it abundantly clear that not only did she speak Valyrian, she spoke his variety as well. That's nothing that was in the script. That was purely my decision because I understood the situation. You know, I'd read the books. I knew, you know, all the context of the previous, and so that was just purely up to me. So it's like it's all of those things combined, you know. It's partly the script and then partly what you bring to it. And yeah, scenes like that are really my favorite thing to do, where it's like I feel like I'm making a meaningful creative contribution beyond acting essentially as a translator, you know. Yeah, and then, you know, you don't always get to do that with every scene. Sometimes it's just, you know, just translate the line because that's what makes sense. But every so often, you can really do something special. And yeah, that was one of my I think that was one of my favorite scenes that I've ever done, and like not just what I put into it, but also how it came off on the screen and its relative importance to the series. That's, I think, one of my best moments. I really like that.
Gotcha. Yeah. And what if there's some a pre-existing material like Game of Thrones, like the books that existed before, let's see. And what if you already have bits and pieces or fragments of a language? How do you bounce off of those and create, like, come up with something new?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just the first step is to actually see what you got, to go through the books and examine all the existing material, and analyze it. And as a linguist, that's what you do, right? You find you find bits of language you don't know, and you analyze them to figure out how they work. So that was easy and fun, because the first thing that I wanted to do was see, was the stuff that George R. R. Martin had created, was it consistent? And so it was consistent, and that was good. So at the very least, it wasn't like he said that, the word rakar meant, white lion in this context, and it meant like, cherry soda in some other context. All the stuff that he created was consistent and made sense. The second question was like, did it make linguistic sense, or was it just like totally improbable that a language wouldn't work that way? But then also there again, it was like, no, a language could plausibly work this way, so that's fine. Was it necessarily as interesting as something I might have done on my own? No, not necessarily, but that's all right. It was consistent, and it actually looked and felt like something a real language could be. So I was like, all right, that's good enough. So then the next step was to say, all right, all of that material that he created is now canon. I have to create the material that supports it, so that it looks like, it looks like all of his stuff came from something I created. And that takes a little bit of skill, but it's not difficult. And it's fun. You essentially create word forms that look like they fit with the original word forms that were created, and you create grammar that fits with the grammar that was created, that he had created previously, that fit with it, that made sense to go with it. So that wasn't too bad, actually, especially not for Dothraki. That wasn't too bad. I thought it was a fairly straightforward process, and I think the result is the result will look to the fans like, essentially, my goal was achieved. I think that it looked like the stuff I created existed before the Dothraki that was in the books.
Yeah.
And that was really the goal, because we just wanted to make sure that it was George R. R. Martin's world come alive,
Interesting. And basing off of that, how do you come up with scripts, like the calligraphy for a language?
Yeah, that's a different thing. I don't always get to do that, but it's one of my favorite things to do. I got to do that for shows like Defiance on Sci-Fi, Starcrossed on the CW. For Bright, Netflix, I got to do a couple. I did a few for Another Life on Netflix, for Shadow and Bode on Netflix, The Witcher on Netflix. So that was a lot of fun. And for those, it's a little different and a little similar. So unlike the history of language, we know the history of writing in our world. Like, we know it from the very beginning and exactly what happened, which is a wonderful thing, because we don't know that for language, and I don't think we ever will. We don't know how language first emerged. We don't even know. We know we're barely scratching the surface. Our knowledge of language goes back about 6,000 years, but we know that language itself goes back like 100,000 years. So we'll never know. But with writing, right? Writing only goes back a few thousand years, and so you can do the same thing. You can create a full writing system from the earliest history to the modern stage. That is, you can start with pictographs and decide, okay, what type of a system is it going to go to next after the pictographs? Is it going to evolve from pictographs into like a syllabic system or an abjadic system, one that's just for consonants? And then how will the writings, like the way that you write the glyphs change based on what they write on and what they write with over the centuries? And little by little, you can evolve a new writing system. And so that's how I do it. I started at a very early stage and I moved forward. And certainly it's great to draw inspiration from existing writing systems, as long as you can do something a little different. My favorite type of writing system to create is what's known as an abugida, which should be very familiar to anybody in India, because most of the scripts in India are abugidas. Devanagari and certainly the Sinhalese are abugidas, where you have the base consonantal glyph, and then the vowels kind of like added in addition. Those are absolutely my favorite type of scripts to create. And yeah, certainly my favorite script of all time is actually Sinhalese. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. It's got just the right balance of ornamentation and functionality. It's like, it looks beautiful, but it doesn't go like totally overboard. For one that does go totally overboard, by the way, you should check out the Cham script from Vietnam, CHAM. That one goes overboard. It's nuts. There's just too many curly cues. It's too much. Sinhalese is just right. I absolutely love it. Favorite script.
Wow, that's interesting. And being a linguist, like, is it easier to pick up languages? I mean, I think that's pretty much a given, right? But when it comes to like, you'd probably understand the grammatical rules and everything, but is it easier for you to speak as well, or is it a little bit difficult? Like, do you go through the same process? How does that work out?
Well, those two things aren't actually related. If you have somebody who's a linguist, what they're probably really good at is they're probably making good and correct assumptions about analyzing linguistic material they haven't seen before, right? They'll be able to guess better than others because they've seen a lot, and they've worked with tons of languages. They've seen everything. But that doesn't necessarily translate to being able to speak a language very well. In that regard, I think I'm better than the average person, but not because of anything that has to do with linguistics. It's just because, I don't know, I really like it. I've studied a lot of languages. I can pick up a small amount quickly. I'm not somebody that can be like hyper fluent, but I can get small stuff pretty quick, especially because I've studied so many that the beginnings are a little easier to pick up on. However, I've met people that I'm truly envious of, who are quite good at this, and who are the types that will just absolutely pick up a language in like a couple of weeks, just being in a certain place. And I will tell you, for those who want that or want to approach that, the thing that I notice about these people is that they absolutely do not care if they make a mistake. Like, they also don't care if they sound bad. Like, it just doesn't faze them at all. They keep getting after it. They keep trying. They make little mistakes here and there, and if they're pointed out, they just laugh and they keep going. They don't care if they sound like a 4-year-old, you know? Like, I'm serious. They just get after it. Like, they absolutely don't let anything stop them from trying to speak the language that they're trying to learn. And honestly, I think that's what helps them, because so many times, especially as adults, so many times we let the fear of being embarrassed, or of sounding silly, or of sounding stupid, or of saying something we don't mean to, we let that fear stand in the way of us practicing. But of course, like, you're just learning a language. It's unreasonable to expect that you're going to speak this language you're just starting to learn as well as a language you already know fluently. It's like, it's ridiculous. I mean, you should be embarrassed for thinking that you can do that. You can't. So if you know that, right, why not just lean into it and say, hey, whatever, I'm going to make a whole bunch of mistakes, but if I just keep paying attention and trying, maybe I'll get better, you know?
Sure. You've written a book as well. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so
Multiple books, I guess.
right, you probably are referring though to The Art of Language Invention, which was,
Exactly.
yeah, that was the one that's like about, you know, how I create languages and just trying to teach language creation, at least to a certain extent. That was really inspired by my experience with the early language creation community, because when I began, like, my very first language was terrible. It was irredeemable. It was not a good language, and really not worthy of comment or study, and certainly not worthy of even my attention. I thought it was really good at the time, but, you know, as I started to look at other people's languages, I realized, oh no, this is really bad. This is terrible. And as I got better creating languages because I reviewed others' work. You know, I saw what they did. I interacted with language creators online. I listened. Um, I practiced, and eventually I got better, and I got to a point where I felt pretty good with what I was doing. There's certainly a lot I learned from linguistics, but not everything, not even most of it. Most of it was learned from other language creators, other people who tried, and who did better, you know. And the thing I saw was that the younger conlangers who were coming to it now, um, they were there, but because they were not learning from the older community, because they weren't finding them. You know, this was like a community that was all based on email, just an email listserv, common enough in the 90s, but not common in 2015, you know. Uh, um, social media, which is group phobic, you know, there's no way to have groups on Twitter. You just on there by yourself shouting at everybody. And if you're lucky, you tweet something that everybody likes and that gets shared a bunch, but that's not a group. That's just the world, right? And so I saw a real disconnect between these newer conlangers and what they were doing, and the wealth of knowledge that was being lost in this older community. And so that was really the hope with creating the book, was to try to get some of that knowledge that was not being passed on, and to pass it on in a way that, you know, others could digest. It's kind of funny that that would be in book form, you know, since all this stuff was on the internet, and somehow the book was the thing that bridged the gap. So that was really the goal, though, because they were just making the same mistakes that we'd done years ago and had already fixed. We'd already gotten past. It was like, man, what's going on? Shouldn't be, but, you know, so that was the goal, really.
That's good, because not everybody has to, make the same mistakes. Like with resources like that, they can of course, collapse the timeline and hopefully evolve the, help towards the evolution of conlanging as a whole. So that I think is a pretty big service that you've done. So,
Yeah.
I'm curious, have you ever included any has Sinhalese ever influenced any of the languages that you created, the script?
Yeah. I mean, no, I never included any Sinhalese words, but you can. Well, nobody would have seen this script, but like there is one that I did right before I created Dothraki, where it's like you can see it was very much inspired by Sinhalese. It wasn't as good, for a couple reasons. One, I mean, nothing's going to be as good as Sinhalese. It's just amazing. But two, I wasn't as good at font making then. I could do it better now. But yeah, like that was the language I was working on before Dothraki, just on my own. And then Dothraki came along, and I just shelved it, so nobody really saw that one. But
Yeah, that's true.
yeah, but that one was like, that script that I created was really kind of like my homage to Sinhalese. It was just, what a beautiful script. I really liked how it worked. Yeah.
Yeah, true. I really enjoyed Shadow and Bone, and I think like the language itself, like when you create a language, it adds to the whole world building, and particularly with a series like you said, it runs for like quite a long time, and people tend to adapt and they tend to familiarize themselves with the language, the world itself. And I don't know if this has occurred in any of the films and the TV series that you've done, but uh, has the script or the language in any way influenced the production design around within the film? If so, in what way?
Yeah, actually, the easiest place to see that is on the show Defiance I worked on. Um, I um, I created a number. I created, well, early on. I created three different scripts, and they, in particular, for one of them, the Indigenes. It was a group of aliens. I created a script that was a series of interlocking hexagons. Um,
Mm-hmm.
or like it was like they had an outer hexagon and an inner hex, and then the whole thing would be written so that you just write them in a row and you could stack them up, so that there was no space between anything. It was just a huge grid of hexagons. Um, and the production designers really liked that. And it's like I just shared that with them, like I didn't actually work with them, but they liked it so much that they ended up building that into a lot of the sets, and and like went even into the character designs. So at that time, like the Indigenes were supposed to have a certain look, but once they saw that hexagonal script, they actually made their skin hexagonal, just a huge pattern of hexagons all over their skin, and they gave them hexagonal eye lenses, like
Mm-hmm.
contact lenses, so that their pupils were hexagons as well. And then they used the hexagonal motif in Indigene architecture uh, throughout throughout the sets. Um, and that's something that it was just like, it didn't exist before the script I created. Um, and I chose hexagons because I wanted something that tiled, and I wanted it to be squares was too easy, and triangles was going to be too difficult because you'd have to flip them,
Yeah.
you know. And so then the hexagons made the most sense, and so I just went with that. Um, but yeah, that entire element came directly from my script, and it was just incredibly gratifying. Yeah, working on that show, Defiance, was the greatest experience of my life. I absolutely loved working on that show for so many reasons, and I wish that it had ran for longer than 3 seasons. It's a wonderful experience.
It's brilliant how your work fit into the production design, character costume design, all of that, and like you know, how important do you think conlang is, especially if you are creating like a fantasy movie or sci-fi where you have some sort of a new culture? Like, how important do you think that is? Like, how important do you think it is to invest in a professional conlanger? Because from what you told me, it definitely adds to the world building. It definitely adds to the whole production quality. But not everybody might have access to that, and some people might think it might be a waste of time because not everybody and not the entire audience understands it or sees the depth. But what do you think? Like, how would you convince somebody to do it?
It's it's not something that I think you really have to convince somebody of if it's not in their heart necessarily,
Mm.
because I mean, when you get right down to it, there's not a lot that's really important when it comes to your production. Um, I don't know if you remember this, but there was this theory of drama, like actual like theater drama in the 70s. I think it was, maybe it was the start in the 60s, but they didn't have sets or costumes for anything. So like it would be a Shakespeare production, but everybody would just be wearing the street clothes that they came in with. And there would just be like a couple of stools on stage or boxes. And there would be absolutely no set at all. And they would just do Shakespeare. And it was a theory that it was like all that other stuff, it's just extra, because what was really important were the words and the performance, and everything else was just a distraction. And so it's like, if you want to do that, you can do that, and you could do that with a TV show, right? You don't need to invest in expensive sets or anything like that. I think part of the point is that you can. And that was really why, like, there were two movies that I think really changed a lot, that maybe people don't think a lot about. One of them was Lord of the Rings, and the other one was Spider-Man, the very first Spider-Man, because we had some fantasy movies like in the 80s, really, and it was like it was the Jim Henson Creature Workshop, and it was like, so things like Legend, Dark Crystal Labyrinth, it was like, this is what we can do, and then with superhero movies, it was the original Batmans with Michael Keaton. It was like, this is what we can do. Well, Lord of the Rings and Spider-Man came out, and it raised everything to an insane degree. And it was like, this is what we can do now. This is what computers can help us do. We can actually see Middle Earth, and Spider-Man can actually do all this shit, and it looks good and it looks real. This is what we can do now. Those two movies like changed everything, because it's like there is no Marvel Cinematic Universe without that original Spider-Man, right? And it's like, Lord of the Rings, right? That entire trilogy, that's what ultimately led to Game of Thrones later on, because it was like, you can actually use all these new tools to go back and revisit fantasy, and go back and revisit like what exactly a superhero movie can be, how realistic it can look. And that was the point. That was the point for both of those. It was like taking the absolutely fantastic and making it look realistic, so that an audience could look at it and say, that makes sense in my head. It doesn't feel like I'm looking at a prop or a puppet or CGI. It looks like I could actually walk outside and see this, that was the point, right? And that was where they were showing, this is what you're supposed to do with CGI, right? And so if that's the point, then basically something like conlanging is just pushing further in that direction, because it's easy for anybody to create gibberish, and it just functions as it performs the basic function of, the audience doesn't know what this person is saying. Anybody can do that, right? But to actually get something that has the rhythm of a real language, that's difficult. And that requires somebody who knows what the hell they're doing, right? And so it's like, if you want to push in the direction of realism, like if you want to invest in really high level CGI to actually make it feel real, then yes, you probably want to push in the direction and get a conlanger to do something that is actually going to work, and that actually makes sense, that actually sounds good. But it's like, if you want to do something different, you can do something different. It just depends what your take on it is. It depends on what your goal is. Like for some things, the goal isn't realism. For some things, like, you want some element of camp, or you want some high level of style that doesn't look realistic, but looks like a certain style or feels like a certain style. Or sometimes you just want something that's really stripped down, because that's the point, So, in cases like that, sometimes it's like, now we're just going to have everybody speak English. It doesn't matter if it's set in Russia, in South America, or in Middle Earth. We just want them speaking English, because that's not the point. And so it's like, if that's the goal of that director, then you can't say that's wrong. That's just what they want, right?
Sure.
The goal is, for something like, especially what I do, it's like, if you want to push in the direction of realism for science fiction and fantasy, this is a tool that you can use. And we can do it now better than we've ever done it before. So just be aware of it. That's really what I think. That's really my goal. It's not like I think every single production that should have a created language and they should be hiring a language creator. No, I want it to be a choice. I want the director to look at it and say, I want a created language, so I'm hiring a language creator, or I don't want this because I don't need it for the vision that I want. And so I'm not doing it. I want it to be an actual choice rather than them not knowing that the option even exists, you know?
Gotcha. What you just said kind of like left me speechless, essentially, because pretty much, area the facade of filmmaking, kind of like you said, with those two movies, like they essentially set the bar for realism. And with movie making, you essentially transport the audience to that world for how many hours, for the length of its duration, and you make them
Right.
believe that that it actually exists. It's only when you walk out of the theater that you're like, all right, that was just a piece of fiction or something like that. But the influence just
Right.
stays on with you for longer if you see that the effort that has gone into the movie kind of brings out that realism, like you said, and adds to the depth, the authenticity of that story. So yeah, and I think you just
Yeah.
hit the nail right on the head with conlanging's importance. Like it is definitely a tool that can be used to elevate the production. So yeah,
Yeah.
man,
Right on, man.
so cool. Yeah. So you work with Marvel Studios on Thor: The Dark World, devising like the Elven. Is it Elven or is it Elvish? Because Lord of the Rings, it's Elven, and then Elvish comes with. Like, I'm confused with that.
I called it
uh,
Shivaisath.
there's no way I'm pronouncing that. Okay.
It's all good.
So the language of the Dark Elves and in Doctor Strange, the I
Yeah.
can't remember. Yeah, you devised the language for that too. And both of these are comic properties. And was there anything that influenced the language from the comics, or was it like you start off the blank slate?
Um, so with Doctor Strange, there was a lot less work to do. So it was basically just going with, here are the words that I see, and let's create something that matches that sound. And that was pretty straightforward. With Thor the Dark World, that was fun because it's like essentially what it was like fantasy Scandinavia, you know. That's what the whole Thor mythos is. And so with the Dark Elves, then it's like if Asgard is like fantasy Norway, then the Dark Elf world, Svartalfheim was fantasy Finland. And I was talking to the director, and I was like, well, this is my idea for it. And he says, yeah, basically that was my idea too. And so I was like, all right, I get to create some fantasy Finnish. And I've always loved the Finnish language. It's just a really fun language. And so that was kind of like, that was really where I started creating something that fit the names that I had that existed already, and creating something that was evocative, I guess, of the Finnish language, but wasn't exactly like it. And yeah, I did some fun and interesting stuff with that one. Yeah, just language wise, there was some really fun stuff that happened with that one. A lot of that dialogue ended up getting cut because the movie got like shortened a whole bit, and a lot of what got cut out was the Dark Elves. But
Gotcha.
nevertheless, that was a really fun experience. I really liked that.
Have you ever encountered like a director telling you, okay, these are the villains, so their language kind of has to sound maybe harsher or like more ragged, and like kind of like to add to the characters that they're playing? Has that ever happened?
Oh yeah, I mean they often will ask for a harsh language, but the truth is that I mean languages aren't really harsh or soft. It's all in the delivery. So it's just the way that you speak the lines. It's kind of like, English. Could you describe English as hard? harsh or soft? Not really. Not really. It's just a language. But English, just like any other language, can be spoken very angrily, very gruffly, or it can be
Right.
spoken very beautifully, very softly. And so really it's just when they're asking for something that's like super harsh, I just give them like whatever I was thinking. But then, when I deliver it, I talk like this, and so that it sounds really, seems to work.
Yeah, when you said languages don't necessarily sound harsh, what came to my mind was Trevor Noah's delivery of Russian versus Hindi. Like certain languages do tend to kind of like sound scary, and then some others sound musical. But again, like you said, probably the delivery.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any advice for somebody who's venturing out in conlanging and hopefully looking at I don't know, career in film?
Yeah, so like the first thing is the easiest thing is just improve your skill as a language creator. That's the easiest thing to do, because it's something that you can do on your own and something that you can do pretty much for free. I mean, in order to get better at language creation, you really have to do you can do three things. One, study linguistics. And you don't need to do that at a university. There are plenty of books and resources freely available online. Two is study languages, as many as you can, as different as possible. So like like don't study like, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Cantonese. Study Chinese, Turkish, and Inuktitut, languages that are totally unrelated and very different from one another, to give you an idea of the breadth of human language. That's the goal. And then the third thing is just to practice. Create a language, see what you can do with it, see what you're good at, what's difficult for you, what you're happy with, what you're not happy with. Start another one, do it again, just keep going. So do that on your own, get better as a language creator. And then when it comes to, because obviously it's like everybody wants to break in and create languages for TV shows and films. It's not super likely that you will land one of these jobs right at the start, but there are a lot of opportunities if you look at a couple of different things. One is authors who are doing science fiction and fantasy. This might be an easy way to break in because there are so many more fantasy novels than there are fantasy movies in a year, right? So see if you could work with one of them. And then also student filmmakers, lower budget productions. Like you might not be getting paid anything, but then at least you'll know that nobody else is getting paid anything either. So, it's not like the other one getting screwed. So it's like, but offer your services there, see what it's like. Same thing. It's kind of like the same advice you might give for a young actor starting out. It's like, yeah, every young actor wants to star in like the next Marvel movie, but that's not going to happen right off the bat. You do other stuff first. You could do the same thing with language creation, and especially like with the smaller budget productions, it might be cool. Like that might be something they never thought of, and that will be the start. That could be the start of many people's careers in the film industry. And they'll have that experience with them, the experience of having worked with somebody who created a language, and the more people know about that, then, they go on to do something else and something else and something else. And pretty soon they're in a position of power and realize, hey, I have a budget now. I want to hire somebody to do this. And maybe they never would have thought of that before, it's a long game, and it's like this is still a very young field in terms of like getting paid for language creation work. So every little bit helps,
Definitely. David, thank you so much for taking your time. And it's very late over there, and
Yeah.
I don't have guests on at this time. But seriously, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. This was really enlightening, and I personally learned a lot. So thank you so much. And probably after Dune is done, like Dune is released, we gotta have you on the show again.
Rainbow say happy to do it. So yeah, anytime. And yeah, you have a good day over there.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much again, David. Have a good one.
You
See
too.
you guys.